I knew it was toxic, but I didn't want to lose Jesus.
If we can't look out for the people who are struggling, then what does that say about us as people?
It almost always required the death of a dream for them to come out as who they were.
I didn't get sober to be a dick. Hey everyone, welcome back to the 12 Steps to Success podcast. Today's episode is a little different from some of the conversations we've had so far, and that's very intentional. Up until now, a lot of this season has looked at success, identity, and change through the lens of work, careers that stop fitting, burnout that creeps in quietly, and the pressure to keep moving even when something feels off. This episode zooms out. This is not a debate about religion. It's not about trying to convince anyone what to believe or what not to believe. It's a conversation about identity, power, belonging, and what happens when the framework you were given for understanding the world starts to collapse, and you're left figuring out what still feels true, human, and worth holding on to. My guest is Brian Recker. Brian grew up in a fundamentalist Christian environment, went on to become a pastor, and eventually stepped away from the entire system, not casually and not without cost. What I found so compelling about this conversation is the honesty about fear, community, deconstruction, and the very real emotional fallout that comes with changing your mind. Even if religion has never been a part of your life, or especially if it hasn't, I think there's a lot here about how belief systems shape us, how control and shame show up in unexpected places, and how people find their way back to compassion when the old answers stop working. I really hope you enjoy the conversation. So, let's go. I'm very, very excited about this conversation, even though I personally am not a religious person, but I think this conversation is going to be very eye-opening and will resonate with an awful lot of people. And so without further ado, I would love to welcome to the show, Brian Recker. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me, dude.
My pleasure. And so this is very much a Britishism. My first question is always the same for everybody. So what's your name and where'd you come from?
Okay, so I'm Brian Recker, and I'm from Queens, New York, actually, but I live in Raleigh, North Carolina now. I basically left New York when I went to college. I went to a fundamentalist school in Greenville, South Carolina, and then I joined the Marine Corps after that, which brought me to Eastern North Carolina, and I've stayed in North Carolina.
You talk a lot about your upbringing and kind of how faith has been a central tenet in your life since you were a young kid. I'd love to hear about what your childhood was like, your family dynamics, and kind of how that has helped shape who you are today.
Yeah, so my dad is still an independent fundamental Baptist pastor, which is a little bit unusual in New York City. But so yeah, I had a very strict Christian upbringing. Became a Christian myself, got saved when I was 5 or 6 years old, being told sort of that classic gospel presentation that I was a sinner separated from God, that if my status didn't change, then I was going to die and go to hell. And so I received this sort of fear-based message, and that was my introduction to God, to Christianity, to Jesus, to even spirituality. Like the purpose of spirituality in that paradigm was very much to be rescued from that fearful fate in the afterlife. And so I became a Christian very young and grew up in that home, which was very rigid in its sort of separation from the world, is a big deal for fundamentalists. So fundamentalists, for your listeners, some of your listeners might have some exposure to mainstream American Christianity. Evangelicals are the probably largest Christian group in America. And fundamentalists and evangelicals are pretty similar in a lot of ways. They believe similar things about Jesus being God, dying for our sins so that we can go to heaven when we die. But the main difference between fundamentalists and evangelicals that related to how I grew up is that fundamentalists are very much separate from the world. So evangelicals are a bit more culturally relevant. They have rock bands in church. Their pastors wear cool sneakers and, have swag. And they will often be trying to use the language and means of sort of mainstream society in order to reach mainstream society with the gospel. Whereas in fundamentalism, we very much did not use the world's tools to reach the world. We just were totally separate from the world. And so I didn't even listen to like contemporary Christian music growing up. That was considered worldly. So no electric guitars or drums in the church, no fog machines. It was my dad wore a suit and tie, piano only, hymns, every Sunday. And so pretty rigid. And so that was how I grew up.
Wow. So when you talk about the difference between the two, in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, so I've seen the righteous gemstones, so I understand like one aspect of that, but the
Yes.
other end of the spectrum, that kind of very isolationist mentality of keeping you away. How did that make you feel as a kid? Because so much of childhood development is about your social interactions with other people and being able to create these bonds and social skills through varied interactions. And that sounds like every single interaction you were having was controlled.
Yeah, so I did feel quite alienated, I would say, from the world. We in Queens, we moved to a mostly West Indian neighborhood. It was most people actually in the community we lived in were black at that time. And the church that my dad pastored in Queens was about 90% black as well. Most people from the Caribbean or the West Indies. And so in addition to like we had this very alienated perspective and we were actually missionaries technically to New York City. In other words, my dad would occasionally go on deputation, which is to go to other fundamentalist churches to raise money to be in New York. In other words, we weren't self-supporting. So we kind of saw ourselves as missionaries to the city to save the city, you know? A very colonial sort of mentality, to be honest. But that does not only is that I think has a negative impact on the people that you're around, I think, with your approach, but it also had a negative impact on me. It made me feel quite separate from everybody from the world. I was homeschooled, didn't know much about popular culture, popular music, movies. I felt very ignorant and I felt that. I kind of felt like I didn't know and I didn't like that. Like I felt uncomfortable about that. And I remember, for instance, my fifth grade year when I was 10 years old, I went to public school. And so I had been homeschooled up till that, and I go to public school, and I was a total freak show. Like, I felt very lost in the sauce, and I remember that was, I guess that was '97, and it was the year that both Tupac and Biggie died, and I didn't know who they were, and I went to school, and my classmates were crying, and I was like, "What's going on?" And they're like, "Biggie died," and I pretended like I knew what that meant because I just was so clueless, and so that was kind of the kind of alienation that I experienced. And so I'm sure that that's had weird formative effects on who I am now.
I'm sure it has. I also like when you were talking about that, I just had this mental image of the scene from Mean Girls where they talk about like the weird kids that have been homeschooled.
Totally. I love that movie. I resonated deeply with it.
As a gay man, I resonate deeply with every single line in that movie. So going into that system of public school and being exposed to all these things, was that the first time that you felt that you were starting to question things from your upbringing? Or was that a point where when you went home, your parents were doubling down on everything they taught you up
Yeah.
until that point because they were trying to protect you from these ungodly influences that you were now hearing about?
You know, I didn't like the separatism of our movement. And as a result, people would ask me if I was going to become a pastor like my dad. And my answer as a kid was always no. It wasn't that appealing to me, that world, the fundamentalist world that we were in. It was all that I knew. So it felt safe in that way, but it also just wasn't that attractive. And so I was not rebellious as a kid. I went to Bob Jones University, which is the school that my parents went to and met at, a fundamentalist university. That's where they wanted me to go. And I didn't really have any better ideas. I didn't have a broader understanding of the world. And so I just kind of went to the fundamentalist school that they wanted me to go to. But while I was there, I didn't find myself drawn to the other students that were bought in, that drank the Kool-Aid of fundamentalism. There were, I would say, like a big chunk of the student body there were being made to go there. And so they weren't like all in fundamentalism. And then there was like a chunk, like 25%, 30% that were like, they were in the cult. They had drank the Kool-Aid. And you had to be careful because they could turn you in. So I very much found myself repulsed by the sort of true believers of fundamentalism. And I was drawn to the rebels, the ones who were kind of being forced to go there by their parents. But I never questioned during that time. I still wanted to take my faith seriously. So I was like wrestling with this tension of feeling like this expression of the faith is quite ugly, quite toxic. I mean, when you see the culture that it created, right? This fundamentalism, these beliefs led to this sort of narc culture where you couldn't even be your authentic self. I knew it was toxic, but I didn't want to lose Jesus. And it was also really scary to consider that I would potentially deconstruct some of that stuff because, again, when I first learned about Jesus and I learned about God when I was very young, I also learned about the consequences for not believing in God, for not believing in Jesus. And for me, to leave Jesus was to put my eternal soul in peril and to risk hell in the afterlife. And so I didn't ever really deconstruct Jesus, but I did deconstruct fundamentalism while I was at Bob Jones. And so I like to say that my first step of deconstruction was going from being a fundamentalist to being a mainstream evangelical, which to some people that sounds funny because evangelicalism is quite conservative still, theologically and culturally. But for me, it was a huge progressive leap compared to the fundamentalism that I grew up in. And it felt very liberating because now I could wear jeans to church. I could listen to Christian rock music. I could, even have an occasional beer as long as you don't get drunk, that sort of thing. And so that was kind of the movement that I made post college, which was disruptive. My parents grieved in some sense that I was no longer a fundamentalist like them. So in some ways, that was like ripping off the first band-aid of deconstruction. Because sometimes the hardest part of deconstruction is that disappointing of your family unit and loss of belonging potentially with some of, who raised you and that sort of thing. And that's what holds people back often.
Yeah, and I was going to say, so you moved from one side to the other. How did your parents react to that? Because if they kept you very much isolated from it for such a long time, that must have been a shock to them, or did they see it in process?
Yes, I think it's funny the things that they'd react to. Like my tattoos, when I first started getting tattoos, that seemed to really bother them. My dad will still, although now he has like more things to worry about. He's like really worried about my eternal soul in general. But for a while, like every time we hang out, he'd just be like, "Why all the tattoos? Like, why do you get the tattoos?" He just, and so they would, yeah, they were kind of bothered by some lifestyle choices in general. I think they were still pretty happy that I was holding on to a lot of the conservative theology. Like I said, evangelicals, although there's a lot of cultural distinctions, they still, and this goes for most evangelical megachurches, if you're talking about like the big ones, like Stephen Furtick and, the Elevation churches, the Rick Warrens, those kinds of like the huge megachurches that really shape Christian culture in America, they believe basically, the fundamentalist doctrine that Jesus was God in the flesh, that he died on the cross as a payment for your sins so that Jesus took the sins on, him that you deserved punishment for. He was punished in your place so that basically he took hell in your place so that you don't have to go to hell and you can go to heaven when you die. That kind of thing that I learned in fundamentalism was still true in evangelicalism. And I think my parents, although they were quite disappointed at some of the cultural shifts and the fact that I was no longer a part of what they were a part of, they were happy at the end of the day that I was still a believer. And then, when I was in evangelicalism, I had never wanted to be a pastor, but I think the idea that I could be more myself, that I could dress more normal, listen to music, all of a sudden I considered going into the family business now. And the idea of ministry became more appealing to me, especially because I had always been drawn to the person of Jesus, and I have always loved studying the Bible. And so there was something about that now that I felt like I could be a more authentic version of it, I began to be drawn to at that point.
And so their view basically was, as long as your eternal soul is fine, we'll let you off the
Right.
leash a little bit.
Yeah, so there was like a minor disappointment. It was almost like pre-gaming, I guess, the greater disappointment that would later follow when I ultimately left evangelicalism as well.
It's one of the things that, for me, has always made me question religion as a whole. And one of the things that I really resonated with as a kind of weird tangent is the film Dogma, which, was written when Kevin Smith was going through his own crisis of faith, trying to understand how he was relating to Jesus and God. And there is a line in Dogma that says church laws are fallible because they're created by men. And that's something that really stuck with me because I was like, yeah, if man creates
Mhm.
something and I have to take him at his word, and I know that inherently humans have the ability to lie,
Right.
that is a big red flag immediately.
I have to rewatch that movie. I saw it many, many years ago, pre-deconstruction even, when it was kind of heretical. So I had to like enjoy it while also like being like, all right, this is a bit threatening to like my belief system, but I was able to kind of parse it out. But I bet I would enjoy it a lot more now. But no, you're absolutely right. I grew up in fundamentalism. Everybody was going to hell except for us. We had a very small circle of who was in, and there were a lot of outsiders. Catholics, for example, my dad would say that, the Pope was maybe the Antichrist and that Catholicism was a cult and Catholics would be hellbound. But also Pentecostals, even, that the way that they interpreted the Holy Spirit and would speak in tongues, we didn't do that. And this is in many ways human nature. tribalism, othering. We find our safety by creating in-groups and out-groups, and we belong to the in-group, and therefore we have safety as a part of that belonging. What's especially nefarious, though, about attaching it to a fear-based religion is that we're not just saying, I'm a part of this group and this is my social group. We're also saying that everybody outside of that is literally going to go to hell for eternity. So it's like this very punitive thing that lies on everybody except for us. And it does have an alienating effect in your interpretation of other people. And I like to say now that, I don't actually need God for that. I don't need God to other people. I don't need God for tribalism, to think that I know better than other people and that I'm in and you're out. The Bible talks about the flesh. I think in some ways the flesh does that just fine. Like my human nature can tend towards that. For me, God is the power that pulls me out of that mindset. That helps me recognize that actually we're all in this together and that we're much more alike than we are different. And that helps me to see my neighbor and myself and my neighbor. But unfortunately, the fear-based religion that I grew up in actually drew me into my worst impulses rather than liberated me from them.
Yeah. And I think, I really love that idea about you don't need any of that for that kind of tribalistic connection with people. And, going back to dogma, that's one of the things it kind of touches on is the idea that, the churches that man builds is this very much patriarchal view of showing off your religion as opposed to how you really connect with religion. And what I understood from reading interviews with Kevin Smith at the time was it was his realization that wherever I am, God is in me. It doesn't matter if I'm in a church or if I'm with a certain group of people. If I believe God is with me, God is with me. And that's all I need for my faith. And I thought that was a really beautiful message because it broke away from this much more traditional view of religion of like, you show up, you get on that front pew on a Sunday morning just to show you're more pious than anybody else. And it's like a competition of who's more religious than the next person. And like that never made any sense to me. But also, it very much stems from being in the UK. Victorian moral regulation theory is the idea that you can use religion to control people. And the idea in Victorian times was if you can use religion to instill a sense of fear in people, that will make them more obedient workers for the Industrial Revolution. And so the idea was what we'll do is we'll use religion as a way to impose all these social standards on people, but we won't use it in a punitive way where we have to punish people for breaking them. We'll rely on the natural human instinct of shame, fear, guilt, so that people self-regulate, so that when they think they're doing something wrong, they punish themselves for it. And it's a really fascinating way of controlling the population.
No, in many ways, our religious system conditioned us for compliance. I mean, the parenting styles as well within these systems were usually authoritarian, obedience-based parenting rather than connection, which reflected our view of God. We believed in an authoritarian God who was ultimately a punishing God. And so it kind of justifies those authoritarian frameworks in the rest of society as well, if this is what God is like. And, I see even now, like Christians essentially putting the divine sanction on authoritarian violence in the world. Even just, a couple of weeks ago with the shooting of Renee Good, many Christian leaders saying afterwards, well, she should have just obeyed the law if she wasn't resisting officers and that sort of thing, as if like any resistance to authority deserves a death sentence. And ultimately, if you believe that an authoritarian punishing God, I do think that it kind of conditions you for this law and order spirituality.
Yeah. And I think, that's one of the things that from the perspective of a queer person, this kind of obedience-based punishment theology that has told us as a community that we're not welcome and therefore we will be punished. It's kind of pushed us into a position where there's so many queer people who probably would very happily let religion into their life and allow that to be something that is a fundamental part of who they are, but they've been pushed so far away from it that it now has no control over them. And I think that's one of the things I love about your Instagram feed is you use your faith still to highlight the teachings of Jesus in a way that are about moving communities forwards and bringing us together. And I just think it's so refreshing to see someone who is so compassionate and considerate for others. And so I wanted to kind of ask you, how did you get to that stage? So from this very much kind of control-based theology and this upbringing, what brought on your own deconstruction to allow you to become this incredibly compassionate person that you are today?
So, we're all on a journey, and after becoming an evangelical pastor, a few years in was when Donald Trump rose to prominence within the Republican Party first, and then became president in 2016. I would say 2015, 2016 was when I first started to really question what I was a part of and whether it was a net good in the world or whether we were actually potentially doing a lot of harm. And I remember my essential reaction was, this is not who we are. That's how I felt at the time. Was like, this is not who we are. And I would say my journey from 2015 to 2020 was kind of slowly coming to the place of understanding and basically admitting, yeah, this actually is who we are. This is who we've been. It just took me some time to see it. And so for those years, I was still preaching, I was still pastoring, and I was trying to push back against what I saw as some of the most harmful elements of our movement. And in the grind of it, you can sometimes not step back and actually assess, what am I doing? And am I doing more harm than good? And 2020 gave me that opportunity to reflect on my life, what I really wanted to do with my life, whether I wanted to continue to contribute to these systems or not. And that fall, when we began to regather again after taking a break from in-person gatherings, my heart was not in it. I found it really hard to come back together because during that year, I had not only seen evangelicalism on its worst behavior in many ways, refusing to do some of the most basic things to love their neighbors, but also that summer there was a massive reckoning with racial inequality, the George Floyd protest that summer. And I got to the place where I believed that evangelicalism ultimately was doing more harm than good. And for me, the major discipleship crisis was that people in our church were embracing this MAGA idea, which was anti-immigrant, xenophobic, denying the really humanity of our Black and brown neighbors in many ways, and certainly queer people. So it got to the place where I realized that in order to actually keep it about Jesus, I needed to step away from evangelicalism. And so that was a pretty brutal decision because that was like all my people. But what I found when I put in my resignation and I also moved away from the small town I was in was that I wasn't even aware of the ways in which I was censoring myself from being my authentic self because I was having to conform to that system. And as a straight white guy, I also recognized that the system I was in evangelicalism was built for me and people like me to platform voices like mine. Women couldn't be pastors in most evangelical institutions. It's usually a male-led pastoring, and certainly not queer people. And so I needed to get out of it for the sake of the other people that couldn't belong. But when I got out of it, I realized that I had to cut off a lot of parts of myself too to belong. Because even though I'm straight and I'm white, you still have to conform in a sense to that system. And so I found it very empowering to all of a sudden recognize that I could embrace parts of myself that couldn't really be included within that. And, ultimately what my book was about was reconsidering some of those fundamental assumptions about who God was and what God desires from us, and whether this whole thing was about believing the right things in order to make sure you don't go to hell and you go to heaven, or is it about actually having a loving relationship with God in the here and now for the sake of our neighbors, especially the most vulnerable? And that was something that I continue to wrestle through. And as I spoke about it publicly, I found that my voice could resonate with others as well, which led to the book.
Yeah. And those messages are very much the reason why I was kind of drawn to what you were saying online as well, because it just felt very in line with how I've always viewed the world. The fact that it's like, if we can't look out for the people who are struggling, then what does that say about us as people? And, I think it's really interesting as well when you talk about like COVID was the kind of big turning point for you because it kind of created that space. It was the same for me with getting sober. It's like I got sober during COVID because it was the first time I had space to realize how big of a problem it had become. I'd been in the music industry for 25 years. Like everybody in the music industry is a raging addict of some form or another, but we keep running at 300 miles an hour, ignoring the obvious things around us. And COVID was the most amazing time for me because it created that space that allowed me to stop and go, hold on a second, maybe there's something going on here that I need to look at. And I feel like COVID was one of two things for most people. It either pushed them further down a hole or it allowed people the space to be able to go, actually, there's some things I can change.
It's not surprising to me. The it's a spiritual pattern, wilderness, you might call it. When the world as it is stops working, and you enter what you might call a liminal space, which is the absence of security and normalcy, which we long for security and normalcy. That's what we spend most of our lives trying to stay out of the wilderness. We spend most of our lives trying to stay out of that liminal space, trying to stay in the world where I have my world controlled and figured out, and the routine is figured out. But yeah, I did find that when some of that was removed, and that's, by the way, why capitalism, they don't want you to step out of the rat race, because they don't want you to be introspective about this whole system. They want you so addicted to the system that you can't even question whether or not you should be doing something different.
Yeah, when you talk about that liminal space and being out in the wilderness, one of the things that I've seen a lot, because you are very open about the types of interactions you have with people online as well. And so like while doing this work of becoming the version of you that we see today, some of the awful things that get said to you online are horrific. Like you described yourself as a cis white heterosexual man, and people accuse you of being gay, they accuse you of being in a cuckold relationship, like
Yeah.
all of these things
Right.
that are
Yeah.
trying to emasculate you, remove your sense of autonomy, all of these horrible, horrible things that don't feel very Christian to me.
Yeah, they almost always have Jesus in their bio, right? Whenever you see like
Always. Yeah.
inevitably the worst comment you've ever seen on social media, you click it and there's a Bible verse in the bio.
I love the fact that you still highlight that as well. Like you don't shy away from the fact that there are these people who are trying to misrepresent the words of Jesus. And so that gets us onto a nice, seamless segue to the reason I wanted to speak to you in the first place, because I am a huge fan of your book, Hellbent, which came out at the back end of last year. Through doing all of this work, obviously that led to the creation of this book. What was the impetus behind wanting to write the book?
There's a few things. I think I'm an external processor. And so I wasn't even trying to build an Instagram platform. I was just speaking out loud a lot of the things that I was internally processing and wrestling with. But as I did, I found my people. I found that I was not the only one processing these things. A lot of people, I think through the Trump era, became very disillusioned with mainstream American Christianity because this is where it led us, right? Like my earlier realization, this is exactly who we are. I now see that Trump is not an aberration in the conservative Christian evangelical movement. He was the natural culmination of their hopes and dreams in many ways. And so it's like, well, what does that say about the spirituality of that movement? And how did it get us here? A particular version of Christianity and a particular version of Jesus very much fueled and gave us the moment that we're in. And that was the version that I grew up with. And what I came to see, though, and I'm not saying that everybody has to hold on to Jesus, everybody should believe in Jesus. I'm not trying to even push Jesus on anybody. But for me, I did have a moment where it's like, am I going to stay Christian or not? And there's a stubbornness in me that was just like, I'm not going to let the people with the worst opinions in the country have the last word on who Jesus is to me, because I think Jesus is better than that. I don't think he needs to be defined by people who are using him as a mascot, essentially to
Mm.
endorse their power plays and their structures and hierarchies of domination, rather than as the liberator that he really was. And so much of the reason it was hard for people to hold on to Jesus, I found, and why many people were leaving Christianity instead of holding on to a more liberating version of it, was that, like I said, when we learned about Jesus, we did not learn about him as a man, a prophet, a radical liberator on the side of the marginalized. We essentially learned about Jesus as the answer to a problem, the problem of the existential threat of hell, that you were born wicked, separated from God. God was going to punish you. God's going to send you to hell unless you believe in Jesus, in his death. You didn't really need to worry about his life so much. In fact, according to this view of Christianity, you could know almost nothing at all about what Jesus said, did, how he lived, who he spent time with, what he cared about. You just needed to believe in his death as a transaction, as a sort of tokenal transaction to save you from hell. And that part no longer made sense to me, but I realized it was holding me back from the actual spirituality of Jesus, not just the religion about Jesus, but his actual spirituality. And so I still call myself a Christian.
So those people who don't need to understand the teachings that you talk about, I think that's a really great example of how they are then able to weaponize the words of the Bible, taking things out of context and just saying, well, these are the words that I want to use to fit this purpose, because they actually don't care about the teachings. And that's something I'd never thought of before, is like, why do they misrepresent the words when, especially when if you read the broader context of things, then like Sodom and Gomorrah is the kind of obvious one. Is like Sodom and Gomorrah isn't about gay people at all. And so you can take these slightly out of context
Right.
paragraphs to argue a point. And this is one of the reasons why I love your book so much, is like the way you talk about these things, it gives me this ability to understand why people are acting in a way that I've never understood before. And so, I think that there's something really powerful about your book for people who aren't religious. And I know at the beginning of the book, there's a preface about, it's very much targeted at people who are questioning kind of the faith that they've been brought up with. Wasn't brought up with faith, but this answered so many questions
I
I've
love that.
ever had in my life that I feel like it's a book for everyone.
I wanted to write it for everyone. You try to have a target audience in mind, and my target audience in many ways was me 10 years ago. I wanted to write the book that I wish I had to help me get to where I'm at in some ways, because I think that there's a lot of people wrestling through that journey, but it's just a muddy path ahead and they're not exactly sure how to get from here to there. But I also know that there's a lot of people that are outside of Christianity altogether and looking at the landscape of American Christianity who are just like, what the fuck? Like, where is this coming from? Why are you guys like this? And I think for folks like that, they might resonate not only with some of my diagnoses, but also with this view of who Jesus actually was that I present in brief in the book that has been encouraging. Some people are like, yeah, I've never been religious before, but the way you talk about Jesus, I actually, I'd be into that, and that's very encouraging. And the hope again is not, I don't need to convert people. I'm not trying to convert people to a particular religion. I do want people to be converted to a way of love, of human solidarity, that these ways of being that are liberative as opposed to dominating and othering. But in terms of how people identify or label themselves spiritually, I hope people don't feel like I have some intention for them in that way.
That's fair. And, I definitely fall into the camp of people who, after reading the book and hearing what you say online, I'm like, yeah, no, I can get on board with that. I totally can. Because, as humans, if we can't show compassion and love and support for other people, what does that say about us individually? Like that doesn't strike me as the
Yeah.
kind of person I want to be. I didn't get sober to be a dick, and I didn't get sober to be miserable either. I can share in the joy of others by seeing other people do well and helping other people do well. And I think that the one thing that coming out of COVID and kind of where I'm at in my life now is the need for community. And I know from how I approach life, I only want to be part of a community that cares about other people. Like a community that's based on fear and anger and guilt and shame, all these really destructive emotions and motives. That's not a community I need to be a part of. And so in terms of fear-based teachings and how that kind of distorts people's understanding of God, how were you able to start breaking that down for you and then being able to introduce that into the book?
I had the privilege of having some theological education, going to seminary. And often in the more evangelical or conservative seminaries, they're not engaging with the actual Bible scholarship. And so I had the opportunity to be exposed to things outside of my world. I've always been curious, I think, and drawn to that. And so I'm a reader. So most of, I do hope that if people read the book, that they spend some time in the footnotes potentially if they want to go deeper, because I'm not just making stuff up. I'm drawing from scholars and other theologians that have pointed out a lot of this stuff, that Christianity has always been a lot bigger than the cul-de-sac of American evangelicalism. And so it was about learning how to listen to voices that I wasn't previously allowed to listen to. So like I said, when I grew up, I was told, here's the small group of people who have the truth. It's really just us. Don't listen to anybody else. Plug your ears. And part of my growth, early on, I realized, okay, that world was too small. Evangelicalism is a bigger tent than that. And most evangelicals wouldn't necessarily say that Catholics are going to hell, but they still would say that only Christians are in, right? You have to be a Christian. And if you're not a Christian, you're going to hell. And so for me, there has been just an ongoing widening of even who I'm listening to and who I'm engaging with. So for example, I have learned so much, especially from scholarship that is outside of sort of the white male hegemony of theology. So most theology that is considered mainstream and acceptable is written by European white guys. But if you read James Cone, well, that's Black liberation theology. But for me, realizing that, like, hey, all theology is coming from a perspective, and that European theology was just as biased as a Black liberation theology, but I was told that that's just the truth. And recognizing that I'm allowed to listen to a diversity of sources and let that inform my perspective, I think that was a really helpful shift. And so I hope to introduce some of those voices to folks in my book as well.
Well, and talking about the kind of Black liberation theology, that for me in your book, the chapter where you talk about white Jesus and Black Jesus, that was really eye opening to me.
Well, you can see how this version of white Jesus was a very helpful tool in the hands of colonial powers to justify their domination. Because I say in the book, you can justify just about anything when you believe that you and you alone hold the keys to heaven and hell. When my way of belief is the one that leads to eternal paradise and everybody else is a wicked pagan on the way to hell, well, then I can dominate your civilization because your civilization is doomed anyway. It's going to hell. So you actually need me. This was affirmed. The Catholic Church, the doctrine of discovery, was the official papal doctrine that gave religious sanction to the project of colonialism, basically saying, yes, it's a good thing for the world for us to do colonialism because we will be Christianizing the world. And right now, they're all dying and going to hell. So this was very much a supremacist. Christian supremacy is really historically connected to white supremacy. And that was a particular view of Jesus, a Jesus that was easily co-opted by imperial powers. And that is not the spirituality that Jesus actually embodied. And so part of my struggle is trying to say, hey, actually, Jesus resisted imperial powers at every turn and was on the side of the people who were crucified by empire. That's what crucifixion was. Crucifixion was what a colonial imperial power did to the marginalized people that resisted that, right? And that's where Jesus stood, not on the side of the colonizer. And so that reframing, I think, is really important, whether you hold on to Jesus's spirituality or not, to recognize that a lot of the times the people speaking for Jesus are actually sounding a lot more like the people that crucified him.
Yeah. And so throughout this process for you, were there times where you kind of felt untethered to your religion or your faith, at least, in terms of while doing this work to kind of deconstruct? How did that show up in your life? Because for me, I feel like if my foundations had been rocked to the core, I would be like a balloon in the wind. I'm kind of unsure. So how did that show up in your life, and kind of how did you wrestle with it to bring your faith so centrally back into who you are today?
Yeah, big time. I in the couple years after deconstructing and beginning to wrestle with it, stepping away from the church, and some of the deconstruction was happening below the surface while I was still a pastor, culminating with me stepping away, and then it escalated and more was going on, and I ended up going through a divorce. I got on anxiety medication. I mean, I was going through it. I really was feeling quite, like you said, untethered from my identity, because as a pastor, that was very much a part of who I was. I was a pastor, I was a husband, I was a Christian, I'm in this church community, and we receive our identity very much through our web of relationships, and a lot of that was severed at the same time as well. And so that was pretty scary. And there were moments too where I wasn't sure if I would still continue to identify as a Christian or not, which was scary to me. Like, if I'm not a Christian, then who am I? And I realized that when I was weighing one as more morally superior than the other, staying Christian versus not staying Christian, if one is better than the other, then you're not actually being intellectually honest. You're not actually approaching it with beginner's mind. You're not actually being true to where you're actually at. You have a preconceived idea of where you're supposed to land. I'm supposed to stay Christian. And for me, recognizing that there is no supposed to, this isn't about being the quote unquote right religion. Instead, I began asking a different set of questions like, what is authentic to me? What leads me most into love? What makes me feel most connected to myself? And when I asked those questions, I realized that there was still a relationship with God through Jesus that made sense for me. But I stayed Christian not because I better or else, because God's going to get me if I don't, but I stayed Christian because I just honestly still believe in God. And Jesus's spirituality still makes a lot of sense to me and still seems to be worth following. And that's holding it in a very different way than I used to hold it, without fear, really. And it did take some time to get there. A lot of that was processing it with friends and in community and meeting new friends. And a lot of them are queer friends who are living out their authentic lives, and hearing their coming out stories actually was really inspiring to me. I feel very inspired by my queer friends who had had to fight to be their authentic selves. Nobody handed that to them. It almost always required the death of a dream for them to come out as who they were. The death of the dream of what they thought life was supposed to be, who they were told they were supposed to be. all of that had to fall away and die. And they had to ultimately say, no, I'm going to be me, not who they're telling me I'm supposed to be. And even though as a straight person, I didn't have to go through that exact journey, I think we all have to die to that dream at some level in order to embrace that authenticity. And so I think surrounding myself with people who experience that death and resurrection, that is the spiritual paradigm. Is death and resurrection. You don't have to call it that. You don't have to put Christian labels on it. But I think even you can see it in the 12 steps. I think that journey down, I think, was really essential in me finding myself and becoming a more free and true version of me.
Yeah. And, you're right. In the 12 steps, it really is about deconstructing these ideas of the version of you present to the world, the version of you that you hold to even when things are wrong. You talked about having a beginner's mind. And I really love that idea of approaching things through that lens all the time. And it's one of the things that I am very conscious of trying to do myself now, is whenever I'm approaching anything, whether it's new or old, is to try and approach it with a beginner's mind and not force my view on people of kind of what I have been brought up subconsciously to believe. So one of the things about coming to the US, I've lived here for 7, 8 years now. And the first thing I realized was we talk the same language, but we do not talk the same language at all. And so there was a language barrier immediately from being able to kind of understand what people really meant or people misconstruing what I was saying. And that forced me to have to unlearn a lot of my kind of social skills in order to be able to kind of create new bonds with people. And so even my Britishism had to die a little bit for me to be able to kind of incorporate who I am into the US because, Americans, I love you in many ways. I just wish you got sarcasm a little bit more or self-deprecation as well. The
I'm
number of
with you,
times I
bro.
will say something slightly self-deprecating and American friends are like, don't be so hard on yourself. I was like, I
Oh,
do not
dude.
believe that I feel that way.
I get that all the time on the internet. People can be quite humorless online. I do show up with a bit of a snark and an edge often. I try to be sincere as well. It's not for everybody, but I find my people.
Yeah. And so with finding your people, have you found that there's been a certain group of people that have been gravitating towards you in a positive way that you weren't expecting to kind of really show up and resonate with your content?
Well, I mean, I would say that the non-Christians, I think the majority of people that are really vibing with my book or purchasing it are probably people who are coming out of high control Christianity in some way and wrestling with that and looking for guidance on that road. But I would say that there is a pretty good group of people who are outside of it altogether I mean, the reality is that whether you're a Christian or not, you have to engage with Christianity in America because it is absolutely woven into the fabric of American life. I'm not saying we're a Christian nation, but we are a nation haunted by Christianity, certainly. I think that one of the great tragedies of the American church is the way that instead of sitting at the feet of people who have been, because that's what Jesus brought people from the margins, people that society said, you don't belong, you need to change, you need to conform. Jesus went to those people and said, those are my people. Blessed are the poor. The last will be first. Those are the people at the center. That's where we can really see what God is up to. And that's what I've found to be true. And yet the great tragedy is that instead of really listening to queer people, the church has mostly wounded them and excluded them. And so I feel really privileged that a lot of queer folks feel safe in my presence and, in the community that kind of has sprung up online as well.
And I think the word safe is actually a really powerful one here as well, because as queer people, generally, as we grow up, we don't find ourselves safe. And so finding safe spaces as adults allows us to create our chosen family. And that's the most important dynamic for most of us, is finding people who make us feel safe and comfortable and make us feel like we're allowed to be our authentic selves. I'm sure there have been times where for you staying quiet would have been a lot easier. How have you dealt with those kind of challenges where by saying certain things, there's going to be a certain type of person that is just going to attack? And where do you find the strength to kind of just keep pushing forwards by doing the right thing?
So there's a few different categories of people. There's there's the people I was close to, and that was harder because I think the thing that keeps most people from deconstructing fear-based religion is not that it's so hard to change your mind about these beliefs. Like, oh, I just love believing in hell and I don't want to let it go. The hard thing is the loss of belonging. It is the idea, and this was hard for me, that people that I had done life with they were there when my babies were born. They helped me move. I helped them move. We showed up for each other. the thought of those people thinking of me as a heretic, thinking less of me, thinking like, oh, he's backslidden, oh, he's fallen away. That was a really hard thing to think. I don't want them to think that about me. But I had to die to the way they thought about me. Ultimately, I had to get to the place where my journey is my journey. I don't have to reject them. I don't have to say, hey, I want nothing to do with you. I have to be true to my journey. And then people who are for me will be for me. And if they say, well, you're different, you've changed, great. Like, let me get to know the new you. Let me get to know these new things about you because I love you for you. I'm not just in it for you to be just like me. I want to know the real you. And there have been a handful of people like that from my past that have kind of stuck with me. But that is definitely the exception rather than the rule. And so the loss of some of those relationships has been hard. I would say that's much harder than just like bullies on the internet. Personally, I think maybe I have a good constitution for it. But when people come at me and call me a cuck or, call me gay, which I'll take that as a compliment. I don't care. Like, so I'm like better dressed than you. Like, what do you mean? I don't know. I'm more emotionally intelligent. Okay, sorry. So I am just like, yeah, I'm not gonna let like the stupidest people get under my skin for the most part. But when it's people close to home, that can be really tough. And I think it's important to have people that know you and to let those people define you. And here's the thing, like one of the cool things, yes, people will be disappointed as you become more authentic and you say, okay, I'm not gonna cut off parts of myself to appease these people that maybe I never would be able to appease anyway. But the people that you gain are people that see you. And that means more. It just does. That means more than somebody saying, "Oh, I love you as long as you stay in the box that I've created for you." But you have to have those people, or it's kind of impossible because we are made for connection and relationship.
Are you still struggling with any elements of the kind of deconstruction or unlearning certain things? Or do you feel that the work that you've done, while it's constantly evolving, has got you to a place now where you don't feel kind of tied to the past? Or are there certain things that kind of pull you back still?
It's interesting. Something I'll hear from people a lot, my book primarily is it's about hell. It's a lot more than hell, as I think, but um, what I hear from people a lot is that even years out from deconstructing, they will sometimes just be lying in bed and think, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm going to hell? I don't feel that really ever anymore. I understand that. And I did have some of that at the beginning. I think that's kind of normal when you're breaking free from a high control structure that is intended to keep you in fear. I think I'm not, I don't have it all figured out. I don't claim to, but I don't need to have it all figured out. I don't think that's the point. I want to be on a journey. And that means that, I do hope that I believe differently in some ways 10 years from now than I believe now. And I hope that means that I'm more loving and more inclusive. The circle has always been widening and I've encountered things that I didn't know that, oh, that means I'm going to have to accommodate that or I'm going to change in these particular ways. One of the things Jesus models for us is that it's always a good reason to change for the person in front of you in pain. I think of so many evangelical parents whose kids come out. I've been going to a lot of progressive churches lately and preaching in progressive churches. And a lot of times these churches are populated by the parents of queer kids who left their conservative churches and went to a more progressive affirming church after their kid came out. And I think that's a great reason to change, to assess your beliefs because of a human connection. That's the best
Mm.
reason to change. And I'm always really sobered and saddened when I encounter the opposite. Parents of queer kids who their kids came out. Instead, they buy the line that, oh, I have to maybe even cut off my kid for the sake of their soul. I have to put distance because I don't want them to die and go to hell. And that failure to continue to evolve for the sake of somebody who is different and who is experiencing harm. And I'm just sure that that journey's not over for me. I'm sure that there are areas where I still have blind spots. We all have blind spots. And I think we always need to just be aware that we will have those biases confronted and we should always be willing to change for the sake of humanity.
I love that. And so I have one last question, which is, and you've done a lot of this work, so it will be interesting to kind of hear how you approach this. If you had one piece of advice to give younger Brian, what would that be?
Wow. I mean, I think similarly to what I just said, that you will continue to change and that's okay. And you don't need to hold on to what's come before, to trust that that journey of becoming is itself God at work in you. I believe that God calls us into that constant change. And so to just, to enjoy the ride, man, and put humanity first. Jesus, I think sometimes we had a spirituality that removed us from humanity. Like it was so heavenly minded, it was no earthly good. Jesus, his favorite expression for himself was not Son of God. It was Son of Man. The Son of Man was how Jesus referred to himself. And one translation for that would be the human one or the human being. Jesus was more, if Jesus was God, what that means to me is that Jesus was more human than we are, not less. And that actually, I want to be as human as possible. I want to be closer to my humanity. And so, yeah, I think that I would encourage myself to just be human and draw near to what feels most human.
That's a really powerful message. Thank you so much, Brian. I really, really appreciate you for like taking the time to do this. And like I say, huge fan of the book Hellbent. My boyfriend's family are in North Carolina, so next time I'm there, I
Oh,
am
hit me up, bro.
100% going to gate crash you at church one day, because I would love to see you in action and just
Yeah,
be
dude.
around the people that have all that joy, because that's what life should be about. And so thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Great to meet you, Eric.
I really loved having this conversation. And a big reason for that is Brian's book, Hellbent, which is genuinely one of my favorite books that I read in 2025. What it gave me, as someone who isn't religious, was a completely different way of understanding Christianity, faith, and Jesus outside of fear, punishment, and control. It helped me make sense of dynamics I've always felt but never had language for, and it challenged a lot of assumptions I didn't even realize I was carrying. More than anything, I love the way Brian approaches this work, with curiosity instead of certainty, compassion instead of dominance, and a willingness to keep changing when something no longer aligns with humanity and care for others. You hear that all through this conversation. If this episode spoke to you, maybe because of your own experience with religion, deconstruction, identity shifts, or just questioning systems you once trusted, I'd love to hear from you. Like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're listening on audio, a quick rating or review really does help. You can find us on Instagram at 12 Steps to Success. That's the word 12, not the number 12. And you can also head to 12stepstosuccess.com. Again, the word, not the number, to sign up for the newsletter. No spam, just thoughtful ideas, books, and perspectives that align with the conversations we're having here and this whole messy middle we're all navigating. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.